She signed the deed like she was signing a parking ticket. $2,000 for a rotting boathouse on a spit of waterfront that smelled of diesel and dead zebra mussels. Brigitte Sinclair didn't even hand him the pen herself. She passed it through her assistant, a woman with a tablet who had clearly been instructed not to make small talk, and turned back to the black SUV idling on the gravel with the heat running. The young man standing on the frozen shore in a coat, 2 sizes too large, did not watch her leave. He watched the lake. 8 months later, Brigitte Sinclair would fly back to that same shore and stand in the cold for 40 minutes waiting for a man who no longer needed to answer her calls. Nolan Okafor had grown up in the lower end of Hamilton, Ontario, in the stretch of neighborhood between the steel mills and the harbor where the air tasted faintly of iron, and the houses leaned the way tired men lean, not quite falling, just no longer standing straight. It was the kind of place where ambition was measured in whether you got a trade or got out, and most people did neither. They stayed. They worked shifts at Dofasco or drove trucks, or did the kind of labor that used up a body by 50, and then kept using it because the pension wasn't enough. His father, Bernard Okafor, had been different, though nobody in the neighborhood would have said so at the time. Bernard was a boat builder, not the fiberglass production line kind. He built wooden boats by hand in a rented bay at the edge of the harbor, the kind of craft that collectors in Muskoka and the Thousand Islands paid serious money for, though Bernard himself never saw serious money. He saw enough. He saw the next plank, the next commission, the next coat of varnish drying under a heat lamp in a space that was always either too cold or too humid. He had come to Hamilton from Lagos by way of Montreal in 1987. And he had brought with him a knowledge of wooden hulls that he said went back 3 generations in his family, men who had built boats on the Lagos Lagoon before the outboards took over. Bernard did not talk about this often. He talked about wood. He talked about the grain of white cedar, the flecks of mahogany, the way white oak spoke to you through your hands if you knew how to hold it. He taught Nolan everything he knew the same way he had learned it himself, standing beside him, not across from him, guiding his hands along a plank and saying almost nothing, because the wood was doing the talking. Bernard had a phrase he used when Nolan got frustrated with a joint that wouldn't seat or a curve that wouldn't bend. He would set down whatever tool he was holding, wipe his palms on his shop apron, and say it simply, the way he said everything. The wood remembers what it wants to be. Your job is to stop telling it to be something else. Bernard died when Nolan was 19. Heart attack on the shop floor, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Nolan found him when he came by after his shift at the hardware store. The hull Bernard had been working on, a 22-foot lapstrake runabout commissioned by a lawyer in Oakville, sat on its cradle behind him, half-planked. The last piece of cedar Bernard had shaped, still warm from the steam box. Nolan finished the boat. It took him 4 months. The lawyer paid him and did not commission another one. The rented bay's lease ran out 3 weeks later. The landlord, who had tolerated Bernard's modest payments for a decade, saw the waterfront changing and wanted the space for something that paid quarterly and on time. Nolan moved out on a Sunday, loaded his father's tools into a borrowed van, and drove them to a storage locker he could barely afford on Upper James. That was 3 years ago. He was 22 now. No degree, no shop, no clients. He worked at the hardware store 4 days a week and picked up carpentry jobs on the side, framing basements, replacing deck boards, the kind of work that kept him fed but kept his father's tools in storage. He had tried 3 times to find a permanent workshop space near the water. The first landlord laughed at his budget. The second said the space was already spoken for, then listed it again the following week at a higher price. The third asked Nolan what kind of boats he built, and when Nolan told him, wooden, by hand, the man looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has already decided the conversation is charity. So when Desmond Firth called him on a Wednesday night in January, Nolan answered before the phone finished its first vibration. Desmond was 25, a welder who worked contracts on construction sites across the GTA, and who had known Nolan since they were both 11 years old and stealing crab apples from the same tree on Barton Street. Desmond heard things. He moved between job sites and talked to foremen and electricians, and the kind of men who knew which properties were about to change hands before any sign went up. He had heard from a plumber working a Reno in Burlington that Lackline Properties, one of the larger waterfront development firms in the region, was offloading a boathouse on a thin strip of shore just east of the LaSalle Marina. The building had come with a parcel they had acquired for a condo project, and it was too small and too deteriorated to be worth incorporating into the plan. They wanted it gone before spring. They're asking next to nothing, Desmond said. Probably less if you show up with cash. Place is a wreck. I think they just want to avoid the demo cost. Nolan asked where exactly it was. When Desmond told him, Nolan went quiet. The address was on a strip of shoreline that a woman he knew from the Hamilton Port Authority, a planner named Rochelle, had mentioned offhandedly over coffee a month earlier. She hadn't been sharing confidential information. She had simply said, the way someone mentions traffic, that the city was looking at the eastern waterfront corridor for a marina expansion project that had been in discussion for years and was finally moving toward approval. She said it like weather. Nolan had listened the way his father had taught him to listen. Don't do it, Desmond said. I haven't said anything. You went quiet. That's worse. Nolan told him he wanted to see it first. The boathouse sat at the edge of a lot that Lackline Properties had already fenced off with orange construction mesh. 2 older structures nearby had been demolished, their foundations filled with gravel. The boathouse itself was roughly 1,200 square feet of cedar-shingled walls on a concrete pier. Its roof bowed in the middle, its waterside doors swollen shut from years of freeze and thaw. A faded sign above the entrance read something that had once been a name but was now just the ghost of paint on weathered wood. Nolan walked the perimeter. He tested the pier with his weight. He pulled the landside door open, working the frozen latch with both hands, and stepped inside. The smell came first, varnish and rot and the deep mineral scent of Lake Ontario in winter, the particular cold of water that has been still for months. The interior was dim, lit only by gaps in the siding where boards had warped apart. The boat slip ran the length of the building, dry now, its rails rusted but intact. Along the walls, stacked on racks that had been built to hold them, covered in canvas sheeting gone stiff with age, were shapes. Long shapes, curved shapes, the unmistakable silhouettes of hulls. Nolan stood in the doorway and did not move for a long time. He did not pull the canvas that day. He did not need to. He could read a hull's shape through a cover the way his father had taught him to read grain through a rough-sawn plank. Whatever was under those sheets had been stored properly, on racks, under cover, out of direct water, by someone who had known what they were doing. And whoever had sold Lakeline Properties this lot had either not mentioned them or not known they were there. He called Desmond from the parking lot of a Tim Hortons 10 minutes later. I'm buying it. Desmond exhaled so hard Nolan could hear it through the phone. The meeting happened the following Friday. Lakeline Properties sent its CEO. Brigitte Sinclair arrived in an SUV that cost more than Nolan's apartment building. She stepped out in a wool coat and heeled boots that were not designed for standing on frozen gravel, followed by her assistant and a lawyer in a navy overcoat. She looked at the boathouse the way people look at something stuck to their shoe. When she saw Nolan, she made a calculation that took less than a second. She took in the oversized coat, the work boots, the fact that he had come alone and on foot, and she adjusted nothing about her posture because she had already set it to the lowest register of professional courtesy before getting out of the car. 2,000, she said. As is. There's a reversion clause. If our development footprint expands to include this parcel within 12 months, you vacate with 30 days' notice. Nolan read the contract. He read all of it. Brigitte checked her phone twice while he did. He did not negotiate. He asked one question about the title transfer, confirmed there were no liens, and signed. He set $200 bills on the portable table her assistant had unfolded. Brigitte looked at the cash the way one looks at something that confirms a suspicion. Good luck with whatever's in there, she said, already turning. We looked. It's just old junk. She walked back to the SUV. The lawyer glanced back once. The doors closed. The gravel crunched. They were gone. Desmond had been watching from his truck at the edge of the lot. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets. You just spent your rent. I know. On a building with a 12-month eviction clause. I know. Desmond shook his head. He wasn't angry. He was the kind of worried that forgets to blink. Nolan went inside and pulled the first canvas. He didn't move for a full 2 minutes. A 1956 Grevette Streamliner. 20 feet of mahogany over white oak frames, the brass hardware green with patina, the deck planking cracked but intact. The wood was dry. The wood was sound. Beside it, a 1952 Chris Craft Riviera, its chrome trim dulled but unbroken, its hull showing the classic barrelback lines that collectors in Ontario and upstate New York would drive hours to see in person. A third, longer, narrower, with the elegant tumble home of a ditchburn launch, probably late 1940s, its varnish long gone but its joints still tight. 7 boats total, all of them wooden, all of them from the golden age of Canadian pleasure craft. All of them stored on racks by someone who understood that a wooden boat kept dry and covered could wait decades for the right hands to find it. Someone had loved these boats. Someone had put them here carefully, and then, for reasons Nolan would never know, had not come back. He sat on the concrete floor of the dry slip with his back against the Grevette's cradle and looked at the row of shrouded hulls in the gray winter light coming through the gaps in the walls. His father's notebook was in his jacket pocket, a coil-bound thing with a cracked green cover, its pages filled with Bernard's handwriting and pencil sketches of hull lines and joint details. Nolan opened it to the first page. The wood remembers what it wants to be. Your job is to stop telling it to be something else. He read it once. He closed the notebook. He stood up and began to work. The first month nearly broke him. He slept in the boathouse on an air mattress he inflated each night and deflated each morning because the damp would ruin it otherwise. He rigged a propane heater that kept the temperature just above freezing, enough to keep the wood stable, not enough to keep him comfortable. He ate oatmeal and canned soup. He stopped buying coffee because $4 a day was $28 a week, and $28 a week was a sheet of marine plywood. He retrieved his father's tools from storage on the first day. The chisels, the hand planes, the spoke shaves, the caulking irons, each one wrapped in oilcloth the way Bernard had kept them. He laid them out on a workbench he built from scrap lumber and stood looking at them for a long time before picking up the first one. The boats needed everything. New planking where the wood had checked. New fastenings where the bronze had corroded. Frames sistered or replaced. He started with the Grevette because it was the most complete, and because the Streamliner was the boat his father had called the most beautiful production runabout ever built in this country. He sourced materials the way he could afford to, which was barely. The marine supply shops in Burlington and Oakville were expensive and staffed by men who looked at him the way the landlords had looked at him, with a politeness that had a door behind it. At one shop on Lakeshore Road, the owner asked him what he was working on, and when Nolan said a 1956 Grevette, the man asked who he was working for, and when Nolan said himself, the man smiled in a way that was not a smile and said they were closing early. Nolan drove farther after that. He found a lumber yard outside Kitchener that sold marine-grade white oak at fair prices and didn't ask questions about what it was for. He found a retired boat builder in Port Dover who sold him 3 gallons of marine varnish at cost because the man had known Bernard Okafor by reputation and had once admired a runabout Bernard had brought to the Gravenhurst Antique Boat Show in 2009. Desmond came by at the end of the second week with a cooler. Inside it were sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, 2 bottles of water, and a Tupperware container of jollof rice that Nolan's mother had made and that Desmond had picked up from her house without being asked. He set it on the workbench and looked around the boathouse at the air mattress, the propane heater, the single lamp Nolan had rigged from an extension cord, the open hull of the Grevette with its exposed ribs, like the skeleton of something ancient. You can't live like this. Nolan thanked him for the food. Your mum doesn't know you're sleeping here, does she? She thinks I'm at the shop. Desmond stood there for a while. He picked up one of Bernard's chisels from the workbench, turned it over in his hand and set it down gently. "This is reckless," he said. "I need that on the record. It's on the record." Desmond left. He came back 3 days later with more food and didn't mention leaving again. The storm came in February, a lake effect system that rolled off Ontario with almost no warning and hit the eastern shore of Burlington with winds that turned the water white. The boathouse groaned through the first hours. By evening, the waterside doors, the ones Nolan had propped shut with timber braces, began to shift. At 9 o'clock, a gust took the southwest corner of the roof, not the whole corner. A section of shingling and the plywood beneath it peeled back like paper, and suddenly the interior was open to sleet and horizontal rain blowing off the lake. The water hit the grevette first. Nolan was under the hull replacing a garboard plank when it happened. He rolled out, looked up at the gap in the roof, and started moving. Desmond was there. He'd come by that afternoon and stayed because the weather had turned and because he had stopped pretending he wasn't involved in this. When the roof went, he stood in the middle of the shop floor with rain driving into his face, staring up at the sky where the ceiling had been. "Nolan, we need to get out. We need to cover the hull. The whole roof could go. Then help me cover the hull first." Desmond didn't move. He stood in the rain that was now falling inside the building, breathing hard. "I can't do this," Desmond said. "I can't watch you kill yourself over a pile of old wood that nobody wants. Then don't watch." Desmond stood there another moment. Then he walked out into the storm. The door banged against the frame behind him, and the wind swallowed whatever else he might have said. Nolan dragged tarps from the back wall. He climbed the racks, lashed canvas to the roof beams with numb hands, working by the light of the single lamp swinging on its cord. He worked until 3 in the morning. When the wind finally dropped, he sat on the floor against the grevette's transom, soaked through, shaking, awake. He took his father's notebook from inside his jacket where it had stayed dry against his chest. He opened it to the first page and read the line he had been reading since he was 15 years old. He read it twice. Then he closed the notebook and went back to work. The grevette was finished by the end of March. He had patched the roof with salvaged plywood and roofing felt. He had rebuilt the hull plank by plank, replaced every corroded fastening, sistered the cracked frames with white oak he had milled himself on a borrowed table saw. The mahogany deck had been sanded back to bare wood and built up again with 12 coats of marine varnish, each one rubbed between applications the way Bernard had taught him, by hand, with wet dry sandpaper and patience. The engine was a 6-cylinder Buchanan flathead, original to the boat. He had rebuilt it on the concrete floor, following his father's notebook page by page. It turned over on the first try. The sound it made in the enclosed space of the boathouse, the low thrumming idle of a marine engine that had not run in decades, was the sound Bernard Okafor had spent his life teaching his son to hear. Nolan stood in the open waterside doorway and listened to it and did not move because the sound was exactly right. He took photographs with his phone and posted 3 of them to a vintage boat forum he had been reading since he was a teenager. He wrote one line of description: 1956 Grevette Streamliner, full restoration, matching hardware, single-owner workshop, Hamilton, Ontario. Catherine Tremblay messaged him within 18 hours. She did not write much. She asked if the boat could be seen in person and if he had documentation of the work. Nolan sent her photographs of his father's notebook pages with dates marked. He did not know who she was. He looked her up that evening and found that she had been collecting antique wooden boats for 30 years, that she sat on the board of the Muskoka Steamship and Historical Society, and that her name appeared in articles about the Gravenhurst Show and the Clayton Antique Boat Museum, and other places he had only ever read about. She arrived 4 days later in a car driven by someone else. She was perhaps 60, gray-haired, dressed in practical clothes, with a quietness about her that made the boathouse feel like a chapel. She walked around the grevette in a slow circle. She ran her hand along the shear line where the new mahogany met the original transom and asked Nolan how he had matched the grain without a proper thickness planer. He told her about his father. She listened. She kept her hand on the gunwale as he spoke. "I've seen a great many restorations in my life, Mr. Okafor," she said. "Most of them are repairs. This one is a conversation with the man who built it. I can hear him in every joint. She wrote him a check that afternoon for $87,000. He looked at it for a long time after she left. Then he folded it into his father's notebook between the pages where the hull diagrams were, sat on the floor, and ate the first full meal he had eaten in 2 months. Desmond came back the next morning. He had heard about the sale from someone at a marina supply in Burlington. Word had moved through the local boat community faster than Nolan had expected. Desmond walked into the boathouse with no expression on his face and stood looking at the empty cradle where the Grevette had been. He didn't apologize. Nolan hadn't expected him to. "Where do you want me to start?" Desmond asked. Nolan handed him a sander. The next several months moved quickly. Catherine Tremblay did not just buy the Grevette. She made calls. She mentioned Nolan to people who lived in the world she moved through, collectors in Muskoka, dealers in Toronto, men and women who attended the antique boat shows Nolan had only read about in magazines. Word moved the way it always moved in that world, quietly, between people who trusted each other's eyes. Within a month, Nolan had inquiries about 2 of the remaining boats, the Chris Craft and a 1954 Shepherd runabout I had not yet started. He used the money carefully. He paid himself almost nothing for the first several weeks, putting the bulk of it back into the workshop. He hired 2 people from the neighborhood, a cabinet maker who had been laid off when a furniture factory in Stony Creek closed, and a young woman who had apprenticed at a boatyard in Lunenburg and come home to Hamilton when the work dried up. He paid them properly. He fixed the roof with real materials. He installed proper heating. He put a sign on the front of the building, Okafor Boat Works, plain black letters on a white background, painted by Desmond on a Saturday when the shop was quiet. He did one other thing he did not discuss with anyone except Desmond. He began acquiring the lots adjacent to the boathouse. 2 small parcels first, both empty, held by owners who were glad to take cash for land they had been paying taxes on for years. Then a third, slightly larger on the water side. He bought them at the prices people were willing to accept in the moment before anything had been publicly announced. He did not tell the sellers what he had heard from Rochelle. He did not need to. By the end of the 4th month, he owned not just the boathouse, but most of the eastern spit. It was during the restoration of the Ditchburn launch that Victor Ashworth appeared. Ashworth was a broker who connected collectors to restored vintage watercraft across Ontario and upper New York State. He had built his business on the assumption that no independent restorer in the Hamilton area would ever threaten his network. The Grevette sale had irritated him. The Ditchburn, when word reached him that Nolan was working on one, was a threat. Ashworth walked through the shop slowly, looking at the bays, the boats in progress, the people working. He stopped at the Ditchburn on its cradle and looked at it for a long time. "You've got some nerve," he said. He said it the way men say things when they are already composing their next sentence. "I'll give you that." He offered to buy the remaining 6 boats, all of them, that day. He named a number that was roughly 40% below what Catherine Tremblay had told Nolan the collection was conservatively worth, and at least 60% below what the right boats might bring at the right show. "No, thank you," Nolan said. Ashworth smiled. "Think about it. This kind of offer doesn't stay open." "I have thought about it." Ashworth left. Within 2 weeks, the rumors started. Someone was telling people in the collector community that Okafor Boat Works was using substandard marine plywood, that Nolan didn't have the certifications for heritage restorations, that the Grevette had been a one-off and anything else coming from his shop was cosmetically polished but structurally unsound. 2 buyers delayed their visits. A third asked for a marine surveyor's inspection before committing, which Nolan welcomed but which pushed the timeline back by weeks. Then someone broke the window. It happened at night. The front window of the small office at the landside end of the building. The rock that broke it was on the floor when Nolan arrived in the morning. Wrapped around it with an elastic band was a piece of paper with 4 words in block letters. "Sell the lot. Leave." Desmond saw it before Nolan did. He picked it up, read it, and went very still. "I want to find who did this. I already know. Then I want to go see him." "No." Nolan looked at his father's notebook open on the workbench to a page of hull line drawings. We answer with the ditch burn. We finish it and we put it in front of every collector in the country, and we make it impossible for anyone to say this about us again. Desmond stood with the rock in his hand for a long moment. Then he set it down on the bench next to the notebook and went to get a broom. That same week, in a glass-walled office overlooking Hamilton Harbor, Brigitte Sinclair was handed a printout she hadn't asked to see. Her assistant set it on her desk between two coffee cups and tapped the headline. It was a piece from a National Heritage magazine, flagged by a clipping service that monitored any mention of properties Lackline had touched. The article was about Catherine Tremblay's most recent acquisition, a 1956 Grivet Streamliner, fully restored, purchased privately for what the magazine called a record price for a Canadian-built wooden boat of that era. The article mentioned the restorer by name. Brigitte read it twice. She set it down very carefully. "Find out everything about Okafor Boat Works," she told her assistant. "The property, the expansions, what's been bought around it, who he's dealing with." By evening, she had a folder. By midnight, she had 2 lawyers reviewing the original sale contract for any clause that could justify reopening it. They found nothing. The contract was clean, written by her own legal team to protect Lakeline so absolutely that no buyer could challenge it, and which now, in reverse, locked her out just as completely. She sat at her desk after the lawyers left. The office was dark except for her desk lamp. The printout was still there next to the folder, next to a photograph someone on her team had taken that afternoon of the front of Okafor Boat Works. A clean white sign, a new roof. The curved hull of the ditch burn just visible through the open bay door. The article that changed everything was not the one her assistant had clipped. Simone Landry was a freelance journalist who wrote long-form pieces for national publications about people who built things from nothing. She heard about Nolan at a dinner. Catherine Tremblay was seated beside her, and over the course of 2 hours mentioned the young man in Hamilton who had restored her Grivet and who was now working on a ditch-burn launch that Catherine said would likely change how the heritage boat community thought about independent restoration. Simone drove to Hamilton the following week. She spent 3 days at the shop. She watched Nolan work. She watched the people he had hired work. She listened more than she spoke, in a way that reminded Nolan of how Catherine had listened the first time she visited. The article ran 2 weeks later. From a $2,000 boathouse to an empire. How one young man outsmarted the developer who sold him junk. It traced the sale, the contract, the discovery of the boats, the Grivet sale, the land acquisitions, the building of the shop. It mentioned Lakeline Properties by name. It mentioned Brigitte Sinclair by name. It quoted Catherine Tremblay's full assessment of Nolan's work. It did not mention Victor Ashworth, but anyone in the community reading it understood immediately whose rumors had just been buried. Within a week, the cancellations reversed. Within 2, Nolan had a waiting list. He took the ditch burn to the Gravenhurst Antique Boat Show. The decision was not difficult by the time it came. The boat was finished. The shop was running. The reputation, after Simone's article, was no longer something he had to defend. It was something he had to live up to. Gravenhurst was the largest stage in the country for the kind of vessel the ditch burn was, and putting it there meant either confirming everything the article had said or losing everything it had built. Desmond drove the trailer with him north, through Barrie and Orillia, and into the lake country, where the water turned dark and the trees came down to the shore. The morning before the show, Nolan walked the docks alone. He looked at the boats already moored in the display slips, half a century of Canadian maritime craftsmanship floating in a single bay. He stood at the empty slip where the ditch burn would be launched and looked at the water. He thought about his father. Desmond found him there 20 minutes later. He stood beside Nolan without saying anything. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Desmond said, "you didn't quit." In the front row of the judging gallery the next morning, Brigitte Sinclair took her seat. She had driven up alone. She had not told her board. She had told her assistant only that she would be unreachable for the day. She wore a dark coat and sunglasses she did not need in the covered gallery. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the water. The ditch burn was launched at 10:15. It came off the trailer and into the water with the particular grace of a hull that had been built to move, not to sit. And the crowd along the dock went quiet, the way people go quiet when something beautiful appears without announcing itself. The mahogany caught the morning light. The chrome fittings blazed. The wake it left as it idled into the display slip was a single clean line that spread across the bay and disappeared. The judging took 2 hours. Nolan stood on the dock beside the boat and answered questions from the panel, from collectors, from men and women who had been restoring wooden boats since before he was born, and who looked at the ditch burn's joints and fastenings and planking, and asked him things that only people who understood wood would think to ask. He answered each one. He referenced his father's notebook. He spoke about Bernard, the way he had spoken about him to Catherine Tremblay, plainly, without performance, with the kind of love that sounds like precision. The ditch burn took best in show. The announcement came over the PA system at the end of the afternoon. The dock erupted in the restrained way these events erupt, with applause and handshakes and the quick movement of people turning to confirm what they had heard. Nolan shook hands he did not remember offering. Desmond was standing a few meters away. He did not smile. He nodded once, slowly, and Nolan understood the nod. The offers came in before the trophy was engraved. A collector from Muskoka bid first, then a dealer from Kingston, then a private buyer from Montreal who had flown in that morning after reading Simone's article. The final sale closed at $143,000. Nolan had not gone 10 steps from the judging stand before he saw her. Brigitte Sinclair had stood up from her seat. She was walking across the dock, past the gallery rope, into the staging area where Nolan was standing. She had removed her sunglasses. He saw her face fully for the first time since the morning of the sale. What struck him was not what he had expected. Not anger, not bitterness. What he saw was the face of a person who had spent a long drive and a long several months looking at something inside themselves they had been avoiding. She stopped a few feet in front of him. "Mr. Okafor," she said, "I sold you that property because I did not look at it. I did not look at what was inside it. I did not look at the person I was selling it to." Nolan listened. "I was wrong about the building. I was wrong about you. That is what I came here to say." She did not look away. "I'm not asking for anything. I came to say it where the people who watched me be wrong can see me say it." Nolan looked at her, then he extended his hand. She took it. The handshake was brief, the handshake of two people who had arrived at a piece of honesty and did not need to dress it up. "You saw the price," Nolan said. "I saw what was underneath." Brigitte nodded once. She turned and walked back across the dock toward the gallery. She did not look back. 10 days later, the city of Hamilton published its formal announcement of the Eastern Waterfront Marina Expansion Project. The corridor had been on the Planning Commission's quiet agenda for years. The announcement made it real. By the end of the month, the parcels Nolan had purchased during his quiet acquisition were appraised at more than 4 times what he had paid. The total value of the land he held around the shop, combined with the show proceeds, the deposits on the remaining boats, and the value of the workshop itself, crossed $1 million in net assets. A reporter from the Globe and Mail called for a comment. Nolan gave a short one and went back to work. The shop, 8 months after the original sale, no longer resembled what it had been. The original boathouse was still there, anchoring the property, re-shingled and re-roofed, but recognizably the same building. Around it, on the parcels Nolan had acquired, 2 new structures had been added. One a modern restoration bay with proper climate control. The other a lumber storage facility with racks built to the same specifications Bernard had once sketched in his notebook for a shop he never got to build. Desmond ran the floor. The title had come about naturally. There were 6 employees now. 4 of them were people Nolan had hired from the neighborhood, tradespeople who had been laid off or passed over or who had carried skill their whole lives without anyone asking to see it. He paid them properly. He insured them. He let them learn on boats that mattered, because that was the only way his father had ever taught him. In the corner of the original boathouse, he set up a small workbench for an apprentice program. He took on young people from the neighborhood who reminded him of himself at the age when Bernard had first put a chisel in his hand. He fed them. He gave them tools at the end of each completed project. The first apprentice Desmond brought in, a 17-year-old from the North End who had been building model boats from scrap wood in his mother's basement and who carried the same hungry attention Nolan had once carried into those same aisles at the hardware store. Catherine Tremblay came by once a month. She did not buy another boat herself. She had what she wanted, she said. But she stayed involved, sending Nolan contacts, suggesting shows, occasionally writing him a note on heavy paper about something she had seen at an event he had not yet attended. Victor Ashworth did not appear in Simone Landry's follow-up piece. He had quietly stepped back from the regional collector scene in the weeks after Gravenhurst, in the way men step back when their leverage stops working, without explanation, in a gradual absence from events where he had once been a fixture. He did not contact Nolan again. Brigitte Sinclair, in the weeks that followed, issued a new directive to her acquisitions team. A short document. It stated that no property under $2 million would be acquired or sold without an on-site physical inspection by a member of the team. Not a photo review. Not a drone survey. A walkthrough by a person who would file written observations alongside the financials. When her board asked for the reasoning, she said only that recent experience had reminded her that buildings contained things, and that contents were sometimes the larger story. On a Friday evening 8 months after the original sale, Nolan sat on an overturned crate in the original bay of the original boathouse. The shop was quiet. Everyone had gone home. Desmond had left with a wave through the door. Outside, the sound of construction on the newly approved marina corridor was a low hum. The corridor that 9 months ago had been only a line on a planning document a friend had mentioned over coffee. He opened his father's notebook to a fresh page near the back, past the diagrams and the dated work logs. He wrote slowly, "They called me a kid with a pipe dream, but an empire is not built with money. It is built with the way you choose to look at what other people have thrown away." He read the line once. He underlined the word look. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the workbench. He walked to the waterside door and pulled it open. Outside, the Shepherd runabout he was finishing for a buyer in Ottawa sat on its trailer in the evening light, freshly varnished, its hull lines clean and true. Beyond it, Lake Ontario stretched flat and silver to the horizon. He stood in the doorway and listened. Somewhere down the shore, a boat engine started. Not in his shop. Somewhere on the water, on a stretch of harbor that had not looked like this a year ago. The sound carried across the cold air the way certain sounds do near water in Canada in the early spring, traveling farther than seems reasonable, full of something Nolan's father had taught him to hear the very first time he had put a chisel in his son's hand. Nolan stood there a long time. There is a small thing worth holding in the middle of this story, and it does not belong to Nolan alone. It is easy, when somebody looks at you and decides you are not worth much, to begin agreeing with them. The slow erosion of believing in yourself does not usually happen in one loud moment. It happens in small ones, in the shops where you were asked to leave, at the counters where someone turned away while you were still talking, in the rooms where a woman in expensive shoes looked at you and decided the transaction was a joke before the ink was dry. Most people eventually take that quietly to heart. They stop pulling the canvas off things. They walk past the covered shapes in their own lives and assume that someone smarter has already checked. But the world is full of buildings nobody looked inside. It is full of skills people carry that nobody ever asked to see. It is full of mornings when someone hands you $2,000 of your own life and asks you to bet it on something nobody else can see yet. The lesson is not that you should buy a boathouse. The lesson is that the people who underestimate you are giving you the most valuable information you will ever receive. They are telling you, plainly, where they have stopped paying attention. And what they have stopped paying attention to is almost always where the real thing is. Listen for it. The way Bernard Okafor told his son to listen to the wood. The way Nolan listened to a friend mention a marina. The way Catherine Tremblay listened to a young man talk about his father. Most of what matters in a life is sitting under a canvas sheet that somebody else did not bother to lift. Lift it.